The first time I stepped into that room, I wasn't sure if I was walking into a job or into a dream. The ad was vague. Seeking female figure drawing model. Discreet, well-paid, no experience necessary. Must be comfortable with stillness and silence. It didn't mention a name or a studio or anything beyond a cryptic address tucked in a luxury tower in the heart of the city. I almost didn't go. But desperation has a way of erasing pride. Rent was due, my scholarship had been suspended, and my portfolio wasn't strong enough to land gallery work. So I went. The elevator opened into a private penthouse, silent, dimly lit, scented faintly with vetiver and something woody, the kind of place that felt like it belonged in a museum, not in real life. Every surface gleamed in charcoal tones and soft brass accents, but there were no photos, no clutter, no personality, just space, controlled, restrained, cold. I stood awkwardly at the threshold until a voice called from behind a thick linen curtain. "You may enter." Male, deep, polished. I obeyed. Behind the curtain was a high-ceiling studio drenched in north-facing light, a single chair in the center, an easel far across the room turned slightly away. And him, but only the silhouette of him. He never introduced himself. "I'll pay by the hour. You'll pose for 1 hour, no talking. You may leave after. If you're late, I won't open the door." I didn't ask questions. I sat, back straight, legs crossed, palms open, eyes slightly off-center, the way I'd seen real models do it. I wore a black bodycon dress and a wool shawl, unsure of how comfortable I was supposed to look. He never corrected me. Time passed strangely. He didn't speak, didn't breathe loud, didn't move from behind the canvas. And still I felt watched. Not in a leering way, but in the way someone listens to a song with reverence, as if I were not a person, but a sound he didn't want to forget. When the timer beeped, he said, "You may go. Come back tomorrow, same time." No feedback, no goodbye, no glimpse of his face, just his voice, low and unreadable, as though he were speaking through a cloud of secrets. That night, I couldn't sleep. It wasn't the money, although it was more than fair. It wasn't the strangeness of the job, although it was strange. It was the stillness I felt in that room. How, for once, my breath didn't feel like a burden. How I didn't have to perform or apologize or explain. For 60 minutes, I was just observed. And maybe, in a way, seen. I went back the next day, and the next, and the next. Not once did I see his face, but I started to imagine it. I began to memorize his silences. There were types, I realized. Long ones that meant he was studying a shadow, short ones that meant he'd made a stroke, and barely there ones, when I could hear him shift slightly, as if leaning in just a fraction to see something he'd missed before. But I never saw his face, not even once. He hid behind the canvas like it was a shield, or maybe a mirror he didn't want anyone looking through. And I never dared to look around. That had been one of the unspoken rules from the very first day. Do not speak. Do not move unless instructed. Do not turn around. It should have felt cold, mechanical, but instead, each session began to feel like a strange sort of ritual. He would open the curtain with precise timing, 4 p.m., he would nod once in the direction of the chair, and I would sit. He would begin. No music, no distractions, just the low hum of the city far below us and the soft sound of pencil against paper. I wondered what he was drawing. Not just what, but why. He never asked me to remove more than a coat, never made me feel small or exposed, but still it felt intimate, deeper than any glance I'd shared across a bar or fleeting moment of affection in the arms of someone temporary. One afternoon, when the session ended and I reached for my scarf, I heard the sound of paper rustling. It was the first break in the routine. "Come see." My breath caught. Slowly, I turned, half expecting him to disappear into smoke. But he stood there, shadowed by the light from the windows, wearing a dark gray button-down rolled up at the sleeves, collar undone. His hair was tousled in that perfect, careless way, but it was his eyes that stunned me. Cold steel, like glass that had seen fire. He held out a sketch pad. I stepped closer. It was me, but not exactly. The lines were softer than I expected, less technical, more emotional. He hadn't drawn a likeness, he'd drawn a feeling. And somehow, in that feeling, I recognized myself in a way I never had before. Beautiful, yes, but not for the reasons I usually tried to be. He had captured something I didn't know I carried, quiet longing, unspoken defiance, a sliver of sadness I never let show. "You draw like you're trying to remember someone," I said softly. He looked at me then, really looked, or trying not to forget. And just like that, the room wasn't silent anymore. The next day, the chair was gone. In its place, a velvet chaise, a glass of water, and a single red carnation. I didn't ask. I didn't need to. I lay back, resting against the curves of the velvet. He moved with a quiet urgency that hadn't been there before. And I began to wonder, was I really his muse? Or was he using me to paint someone else? The flower was always different. One day it was a carnation, the next a white camellia. And then came the night of the calla lily, pale, elegant, almost haunting in its curve. Each time, he left it on the side table beside my seat before I entered. He never said anything about it, but I started to wonder if they meant something. Maybe they were chapters from a story he never spoke, or ghosts of someone else he couldn't forget. I didn't ask, I just posed. But something changed that night. It was raining, hard. The kind of rain that drowned the city in silver streaks and turned the windows into mirrors. The sound was deafening, but inside the penthouse, it felt like time had slowed. He was sketching me lying back on the chaise, my hair unpinned, cascading over the velvet like warm silk. I had worn a deep burgundy silk robe, one he'd left hanging in the dressing room, more revealing than anything so far. When I slipped into it, it felt like shedding skin, like stepping into someone else's story. His strokes were different that night, faster, more emotional. I could hear it. And then, he stopped. The silence stretched. I opened my eyes slowly. He was standing beside me. He'd never crossed that invisible line before, the space between artist and subject. But now, he hovered just above, eyes tracing the curve of my collarbone like he was sketching it with his gaze. "May I?" he asked. His voice was quiet, low, like a secret I wasn't supposed to hear. I nodded. His fingers were cool at first. He adjusted the fall of the robe slightly, tilting my chin with a sculptor's reverence. But the touch lingered. Not lewd, not professional, something in between. I looked at him then, really looked. There was sadness in him, not dramatic, not loud, just quiet and constant. The kind of sadness that lived in people who had once dared to love deeply and had paid for it. "You're not drawing me," I whispered. "You're drawing her." He didn't flinch, didn't deny it. His fingers left my skin. "She used to sit right there," he said, "right where you are now." The air thickened. I pulled the robe tighter, not because I was cold, but because I suddenly felt invaded. Not by him, by her. The ghost in the room. The original Muse. "She was your lover?" I asked. He gave a humorless smile. "She was my wife." That changed everything. I rose to sitting, unsure what to say, what to feel. I wasn't angry. I had no right to be. But it felt like betrayal. Not his, mine. Because a part of me, the part I kept buried, had started to look forward to those sessions, to him, to the man who spoke only through sketches and left flowers without explanation. And now I realized I was just filling in her outline. "I'm not her," I said, voice sharp and trembling. He looked at me then, and for the first time, the cold broke. "I know." And that frightened me more, because in his eyes, I saw something new. Recognition. Not of who I reminded him of, but who I was becoming to him. He didn't ask me to come back. Not the next day, not the day after that. And yet, I found myself outside the building again, umbrella in one hand, the other brushing over my wrist, where his fingers had once lingered. I had told myself I was just curious to see if the studio lights were on, if the calla lilies had returned. But when the elevator opened, it wasn't his usual assistant who greeted me. It was Julian himself. No suit this time, just a black cashmere sweater, sleeves pushed up, charcoal smudged across the side of his hand. The sight of him like that, unguarded, undone, knocked the air from my lungs. "You shouldn't be here," he said, but his voice held no edge. "I didn't come for a session," I replied. "I came for honesty." He didn't move aside, not at first, just looked at me, like I was something he didn't know how to frame anymore. "Come in," he said finally. The studio was colder than usual, not in temperature, in mood. The chase had been pushed aside. Sketches were strewn everywhere, but it wasn't me in them. It was her. The same woman again and again, sometimes laughing, sometimes nude, sometimes standing at a balcony with her back to him. Her face was delicate, similar to mine in some ways, but not enough to explain everything. "Her name was Eveline," he said, voice low. "She died 2 years ago." I swallowed. "I'm sorry." She was the only person who ever saw me clearly, and the only one who ever left without a reason. There was a heaviness in him when he spoke her name, not grief that begged for comfort, but one that asked for silence. I gave it to him. Until he added, "She used to pose for me, like you." A pause, and then, "You move like her." It hurt more than I expected. "That's why you picked me?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even. "Because I reminded you of a ghost?" He looked up then, met my gaze. "No," he said. "I picked you because for the first time in 2 years, my hands stopped shaking." He walked over to the table where my last sketch lay, the one he never finished. He stared at it, then slid it toward me. But it's not her anymore. The woman in the sketch was softer, her smile unsure, one shoulder raised slightly, like she wasn't used to being looked at with such intensity. She wasn't a memory. She was alive. She was me. And for the first time, I realized something. I wasn't stepping into Eveline's shadow. I was carving out my own light. "Julian," I said, barely above a whisper. "Why me?" He moved closer, close enough that I could see the flecks of storm gray in his eyes. "Because when you're in the room, I remember what it feels like to want something again." It was the kind of answer that should have scared me, but it didn't. Because I wanted too. Not just to be seen, but to be felt. And in that quiet studio, full of ghosts and charcoal dust, I took one step closer. There were rules between us, unspoken but ironclad. He would sketch, I would pose. We wouldn't touch. Not really. But the silence between us had started to shift. Not the heavy, hollow silence of strangers, but the kind laced with questions we were too afraid to ask. The kind that felt like foreplay. That evening, I returned to the studio without makeup. No earrings, no perfume. Just a soft ivory blouse and loose navy pants, the kind I could slip off easily if needed. I wasn't dressing for him, but I wasn't dressing for me either. He looked up when I entered, but didn't greet me. Instead, he stood by the easel, staring at a blank canvas with the intensity of someone on the edge of doing something irreversible. "Take the scarf off," he said, finally. I hesitated. My fingers found the edge of the silk around my throat, the only thing I wore that felt like armor. "Are you sure?" I asked. "I can't draw what I can't see." I slipped the scarf off slowly, the silk whispering as it left my skin. He stepped closer than usual. His fingers grazed my jaw, not possessively, not professionally, like a man trying to memorize heat. "You tremble," he said. "So do you." That made him stop. He stepped back. The next hour passed in low breaths and the sound of charcoal dragging across paper. He barely spoke, neither did I. But I felt the way his gaze traced me like fingers, felt the tension in his chest every time he stepped forward to adjust the light. I was no longer just his model. I was his undoing. When he finally dropped the charcoal and sat back, he didn't look at the sketch. He looked at me. "Do you ever wonder what this would look like if we weren't pretending?" he asked. "Pretending what?" "That this is only art." That single sentence pulled something taut inside me. Because it wasn't art anymore. It was intimacy. It was hunger painted in shadow and bone. "Would you kiss me if I asked?" I said it before I could stop myself. He stood, crossed the room, and then stopped, inches from me. "No," he said. A pause. "But I would kiss you if you asked me to." My heart cracked open at the edges, so I leaned forward, close enough to feel his breath. "I'm asking." He didn't rush. His lips brushed mine with the reverence of someone touching something they thought they'd lost forever. There was no dominance in it, only grief and longing and restrained worship. His hand cupped the back of my neck. My fingers slid into his hair. And when we finally broke apart, he pressed his forehead to mine and whispered, "You're not Evangeline." "I know. But God, Elara, you make me wish I'd never met her." The kiss didn't change everything, but it changed enough. The morning after, I didn't know what to wear. Isn't that always the case when a man kisses you like he's drowning, then disappears into a silent night? I chose a simple black turtleneck and jeans, nothing romantic, nothing that would whisper, "Kiss me again." When I stepped into the studio, it was empty. No charcoal, no canvases, just an untouched mug of coffee and a note on the easel. "Meeting downtown. Sketch later." No name, no signature, but his handwriting was unmistakable, careful, deliberate, like every word he ever spoke. I didn't know what the kiss had meant to him, but for me, it had been a shift, tectonic, irreversible. I sat on the stool anyway, staring at the empty wall where he usually hung the day's work. It was gone now, all of it, as if he'd erased every trace of me. He didn't return that night, or the one after. But on the third evening, I found a package on my doorstep. No note, just a dress. Silk, backless, blood red. And a time written on the tag, 8:30 p.m. I should have burned it. Instead, I wore it. The gallery was private, one of his, of course. I'd never been there before, only heard about it in rumors from other artists, always spoken like a myth. He stood at the far end of the room, dressed in shadow, but I would have known his silhouette in a blackout. Julian. Cold, clean suit, black on black, his expression unreadable. The lights dimmed, and then the walls lit up. Every canvas was me. Not me as I was, but as he saw me, in charcoal and oil, in fever and restraint. One canvas was of my back, just my spine, arched and trembling. Another was the side of my face, eyes closed, lips slightly parted like I was caught between sleep and surrender. One was of my hands, clenched into the bedsheets. I couldn't breathe. He walked toward me slowly, his voice low. "I painted every version of you, except the one I wasn't allowed to want." I turned to him, something trembling inside my throat. "Then paint that one." He flinched, like he hadn't expected me to say it, but I meant it, all of it. "Paint me how you want to touch me." He stepped closer. His fingers brushed the edge of the silk at my back. "That's the problem, Elara. If I start painting that, I won't stop." We stood there, breath to breath. "Then don't." The next moment wasn't cinematic. It wasn't fireworks or symphonies. It was silent, painful, real. He cupped my face like I might vanish. And when he kissed me this time, it wasn't restrained. It was ruinous. It was a man breaking his own rules, a man who had kept his hands clean for too long. I melted into him, silk slipping from my shoulders like a promise. But he pulled back. "Not here," he whispered. "You deserve more than to be a moment in a gallery." I should have cried. But I didn't, because for the first time since this began, I felt seen. Not as his muse, not as a substitute, but as me. I didn't see him for 2 days after the gallery night. Not a text, not a call, not even a brushstroke left behind in the studio. But something had changed, in me. I wasn't the girl who waited anymore. I was the woman who'd stood in the center of a private gallery, surrounded by proof of a man's obsession. And now, I was done pretending it didn't mean anything. When he finally returned to the penthouse studio, I was already there, sketchpad on my lap, legs curled beneath me in a silk slip that dared to show I wasn't his employee tonight. He froze in the doorway, dark eyes flickering with something between need and hesitation. I didn't give him time to analyze it. "You paint desire like it's a sin," I said softly, "but you look at me like a prayer." His jaw tensed. Careful. Of what? Being wanted? He stepped into the room, slow and controlled. But there was a current beneath the surface, a storm he hadn't learned how to contain. I stood, walked toward him, then lose it. That night, he didn't kiss me right away. Instead, he sat beside me on the velvet sofa, so close I could feel the heat of him, but he didn't touch. He stared at me like I was the only source of light in a room full of shadows. "You're not like them," he finally said. I tilted my head. Like who? "The women who wanted my money, my art, my name. And what do you think I want?" He turned, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think you want me, and that terrifies me more than anything." The silence stretched between us like a violin string, tight, fragile, trembling. "You kissed me like you were afraid of what it would mean," I said, "and you stopped like it was already too late." He didn't deny it. Instead, he reached for my hand, and for the first time, there was no pretense, no contract, no studio lighting or half-posed sketch between us, just skin, and breath, and truth. "If I love you," he said quietly, "I won't be able to hide anymore." I leaned in, forehead to his. "Then don't." The night unfolded like a slow-burning canvas, every movement deliberate, every touch a confession. He undressed me like he was unwrapping a secret he'd never been allowed to keep. But even then, even with his lips on my skin and my name whispered like absolution, there was reverence, not lust, not chaos, just him, loving me like he'd been sketching me for a lifetime, like he'd been waiting to color in the lines. In the quiet after, he lay beside me, tracing invisible strokes across my bare shoulder. "You're my favorite mistake," he whispered. "Then keep making me," I replied. He kissed my collarbone, slow and soft. "I already am." I woke before the sun. The sheets were still warm beside me, his scent lingering like a secret on my skin, but the man himself, gone. The only evidence of the night before was a single smear of charcoal across my shoulder, like he'd marked me in his sleep. The studio light was on. I slipped into his dress shirt, the fabric drowning me, but still scented with cedar and storm, the scent of Julian Blackthorn. As I crossed the threshold into his creative world, I found him, barefoot, shirtless, standing in front of a canvas I'd never seen before. It was massive, covered in strokes that looked frantic, almost violent. But at the center was me. Not the poised version he painted for galleries, not the woman in silk or heels, just me, raw, eyes closed, head tilted like I was listening to music no one else could hear. I didn't speak, didn't breathe, until he did. "I started it the night I met you," he said, voice hoarse, "and I could never finish it." "Why?" I whispered. His grip on the brush tightened. "Because every time I tried, I painted the truth, and I didn't know how to live with that." He turned toward me, eyes wild and exhausted, the look of a man haunted by a feeling he didn't choose. "You weren't supposed to matter," he confessed. "You were just a figure study, a passing fascination. But then I saw you smile at a child outside that coffee shop. And I saw the way you twirled your hair when you didn't know I was watching. And suddenly, you weren't a subject. You were the only thing I wanted to understand. I stepped toward him. Then stop trying to understand me, I said, and just feel me. He dropped the brush. And this time, when he kissed me, it wasn't hesitant. It wasn't careful. It was desperate. A man who had denied himself too long, finally giving in. His hands gripped my waist like he needed to memorize the curve of my body. His mouth moved over mine like he was drowning, and I was the only breath he trusted. When we broke apart, breathless, he whispered against my lips, "Tell me you're not going anywhere." I cupped his cheek, the stubble scratching my palm like proof he was real. "I'm not, but you need to stop painting me like a dream." He frowned. "What do you mean?" "Start painting me like I'm real, because I am." That night, he painted again. But for the first time, he painted in daylight. And he let me watch. No shadows, no closed doors, just a man in love with his muse, and a woman finally letting herself believe it. 3 weeks passed. 3 weeks of stolen mornings, of half smiles over coffee, of Julian sketching me when he thought I wasn't looking, of 1,000 moments that whispered of something real, something fragile, something terrifying. But Julian never said the word, love. And I never asked him to, because every time I saw the way his eyes clung to mine like they were remembering something too deep to name, I knew, and it was enough. Until it wasn't. The invitation arrived in gold foil. Blackthorn Gallery presents the Muse series. My name wasn't printed, but I recognized myself in every curve of the shadowed silhouette. He hadn't told me. Not about the opening, not about the exhibit, not even about the title. My hands trembled. He said I was real, so why does he keep showing me like a secret? That night, I stood outside the gallery in a black silk dress, the one he loved, the one he said made me look like a midnight confession, and debated walking away. But I walked in, not for him, for me. And there they were. Dozens of canvases, all of me, but fractured, frozen in time, like I was a moment he could never touch again. Then I saw it, the centerpiece, the one he never let me see, the one that had been covered in his studio.
Naked, kneeling, arms crossed over my chest like I was trying to protect something no one else could see. Vulnerable, exposed, loved. The brushstrokes were softer than any other painting in the room. Like he hadn't painted a muse, he had painted a woman he was afraid to lose. "I painted the truth," he said behind me. I turned. He stood in a charcoal suit, tie loose, jaw tight. "You weren't supposed to see it tonight. Then why show it to the world before me?" His silence burned. "This is how I tell the truth," he finally said. "This is how I apologize." "You could have just said something," I whispered. "I don't know how," he said, "but I know I lose you if I stay silent." He stepped closer. "Clara, I love you. I loved you when I hated myself for it. I loved you when I painted that first line. I love you right now. And if the whole world sees it before you do, it's because I'm still learning how to say it with words." I didn't respond. Not with words. I walked to him, took his hand, paint-stained and trembling, and pressed it against my cheek. "Then say it with this," I whispered. He kissed me like the world was ending, and I kissed him back like it had just begun. The first snow of winter had dusted the Blackthorn estate in a quiet hush. Clara stood in front of the vast window, her fingertips grazing the frosted glass, as moonlight poured across her silk-clad shoulders. She could hear Julian in the room behind her, the sound of his footsteps soft, measured. He hadn't spoken much since their confrontation the night before, the one where everything unspoken had hovered in the air, thick with tension but left unresolved. "You haven't touched your tea," he said finally, voice low and composed. Clara turned, eyes tracing the outline of his figure, tailored navy cashmere turtleneck, black slacks, barefoot on the wooden floor. It was the most unguarded she'd seen him outside the studio, and it made her heart ache. "I wasn't thirsty," she murmured. He crossed the room slowly, his gaze never leaving her face. "You've been avoiding me." "I needed space." Julian's expression didn't shift, but something in his jaw tightened. "You're not just my muse, Clara. You know that, don't you?" The words lingered between them, as fragile and dangerous as glass. "I don't know what I am to you anymore," she whispered. "One moment, I'm your obsession. The next, I'm nothing but another sketch buried in your drawer." He took her hand then. Not forcefully, not possessively, but with a kind of reverence. His thumb grazed the inside of her wrist, tracing the faint pulse that fluttered beneath. "You're the only thing that quiets the noise in my head," he said. "I don't know how to be soft, Clara. Not with the world, not with myself. But when I draw you, when I look at you, I remember what it's like to feel something." Clara blinked back the sting in her eyes. She had never heard him speak like this, never seen the man beneath the marble facade. "And when you're not drawing me?" she asked, voice trembling. "I'm trying to find the words," he said, stepping closer. "I'm trying to become the kind of man who deserves you." The silence between them was no longer hollow. It pulsed with longing, with questions, with hope. She placed her hand on his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heart beneath. "Then draw me tonight," she whispered. "But don't just use your hands. Use everything you feel." I found Julian on the rooftop. Not the sleek, glass-paneled one where executives hosted champagne launches. This was different. Hidden. Cracked concrete, rusted railings, wind sharp with winter's breath. He stood near the edge, one hand buried in the pocket of his coat, the other gripping a charcoal pencil, sketchpad under his arm. He didn't look at me when I stepped closer. He didn't have to. He knew I was there. "You shouldn't be here," he murmured. I crossed my arms, my voice steadier than I felt. "Neither should you." Julian let out a humorous laugh. "Touché." The silence stretched. The kind that says everything you're both too afraid to admit. Finally, I stepped closer and spoke softly. "You haven't sketched me in days." He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was tight. "Because it was never supposed to go beyond the canvas. And yet, here we are." Julian turned to face me then. His eyes, usually so cold, were stormy tonight. Not with rage, but something heavier. Haunted. "I'm not who you think I am, Clara." My chest tightened. "Then tell me who you are." He shook his head, eyes flicking away. "I can't." "Yes, you can." I reached out, gently touching his sleeve. "Let me in." Julian looked down at where my hand rested on him. For a moment, I saw it. The flicker of longing. The crack in his fortress. But then he stepped back, retreating behind his walls. "You're just the girl I hired to pose. Nothing more." The words were a slap. Not because I believed them, but because he did. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I turned to leave, heart pounding, fighting tears I refused to let him see. "Wait," he called, just as I reached the door. I turned, lips trembling. "What?" He hesitated. And then, slowly, as if the gesture burned him, he held out the sketchpad. "For you." I took it, hands brushing. When I opened it later, alone in my room, my breath caught. Dozens of drawings. All of me. Sleeping, laughing, crying, unaware. But at the back of the book, one final page. Julian, eyes closed, vulnerable. A line of text beneath the portrait. "The artist never paints what he doesn't feel." And I realized, no matter how cold he pretended to be, Julian Blackthorne had already let me in. I couldn't sleep that night. Julian's sketchpad lay beside me, the final page still open, the portrait of himself, the confession beneath it. "The artist never paints what he doesn't feel." Those words echoed louder than anything he had ever said aloud.
By morning, something inside me had changed. I wasn't just some girl posing for his sketches. I had become part of his world, whether he liked it or not, and deep down, I knew he wanted me there. Still, the next day at Blackthorn Enterprises felt like walking on broken glass. Julian returned to his usual state, cold, commanding, unreadable. At a board meeting, he didn't look at me once. When I brought him his coffee, he barely nodded in acknowledgement. Every part of him screamed distance, and yet I noticed the smallest things. The way his gaze lingered just a second longer when I walked past, the way his hand brushed mine when I handed him a file, the way he clenched his jaw when another executive leaned too close to me. After lunch, I escaped to the art studio, the one he built for his private sketching sessions. It had remained empty for days. Dust covered the easel, the scent of charcoal still hung in the air. I stood at the center, memories flooding back. How he used to circle me while drawing, how the silence between us used to feel electric instead of painful, how I used to crave the intensity in his stare. Then the door opened. Julian entered, silent as always. He closed the door behind him but didn't speak. He simply watched me. The air between us grew heavy. "I thought you weren't sketching anymore," I said, voice softer than I intended. "I lied," he replied. He walked past me, grabbing a clean canvas. "Sit." My breath caught. "You want to draw me again?" He nodded once, but not like before. I sat, slowly, heart pounding. This time, he didn't draw me like a muse. He drew me like a memory. As he sketched, he asked questions, real ones, about my childhood, my dreams, my scars. And in return, he gave pieces of himself. He told me about his mother, about the night she died in front of him when he was just a boy. He told me about how his father had turned grief into power, how he expected Julian to be more machine than man. "I was never allowed to feel," he said, charcoal dancing across the page, "until you." I swallowed. "Julian," but he cut me off by stepping forward, gently placing the sketch pad in my lap. This drawing was different, softer, not seductive, not mysterious, just me, looking directly at the viewer, as if I finally saw myself. "Why did you draw me like that?" I whispered. "Because that's how I see you," he said. And for the first time, his hands cupped my face. His thumbs brushed my cheeks. He leaned in, and his forehead touched mine. No kiss, no fire, just warmth. A fragile, dangerous tenderness. "I don't know what this is," he said, barely above a breath, "but I can't stop." Neither could I. And though no words defined it, in that studio, beneath the skylight and the dust, we crossed a line we couldn't return from. Not as artist and muse, not as CEO and employee, but as two broken people daring to feel something real. By the next morning, something between us had shifted. It wasn't just the way Julian looked at me, like he knew me from the inside out. It was the silence, less sharp, less cold. He didn't need to speak to fill the space between us anymore. His presence alone was thunderous. But Blackthorn Enterprises had its own rhythm, and the world outside Julian's studio had no patience for silent confessions or half-drawn emotions. It started with whispers. In the hallways, in the elevator, even in the executive lounge. "She's the one from the gala, right?" "His assistant. They say she lives in the penthouse now." I kept my head high, my heel steady, even when the stares burned my skin. But inside, I was unraveling. Julian, of course, remained untouchable. At the weekly executive strategy meeting, he walked in like a glacier in a tailored suit. Impeccable, emotionless, dangerous. I sat beside him, back straight, every nerve electrified. His arm brushed mine when he reached his tablet. That was all it took to send my pulse skyrocketing. He didn't look at me once, until the meeting ended. As the room emptied, his hand brushed my lower back, subtle and possessive. "Come to the terrace. 10 minutes."
The Blackthorn Tower rooftop was private, gilded in silence and the hum of city wind. When I stepped onto it, Julian was already there, back turned, staring out over Manhattan like it belonged to him. Maybe it did. "I've heard the rumors," I said, voice barely above the wind. "So have I," he replied. I waited, and "They'll keep talking," he said, "no matter what we do. That's the cost of proximity." He finally turned to me, his expression unreadable, but his eyes, God, his eyes were molten. "I didn't bring you into my world to hide you, Clara." My breath hitched. "Then why?" I asked. "Because I wanted you close, closer than I should." My heart beat against my ribs like it was trying to escape. "Julian, if people find out—" "Let them," he said sharply, then softer, "but I won't let them hurt you." He stepped forward, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear. "I've tried to stay away. I've tried to keep this professional. But every time you walk into a room, I forget how to breathe." I blinked up at him, stunned by his confession. "You don't fall in love, Julian. You sketch, you retreat, you protect yourself." "I never said this was love," he whispered. "But it's something, and I've never felt it before." He stepped back, his jaw tightening again, like he'd gone too far. Then, as if remembering something, he pulled a single rose from his coat. Black, a real, rare black rose. He handed it to me with that same expressionless grace, but his fingers lingered on mine. "This isn't romance," he murmured. "It's a warning." "A warning?" His lips curled ever so slightly. "That I will break all my rules for you, Clara Bennett." I clutched the black rose, unsure if it was a gift or a curse. But I knew one thing. Whatever this was between us, it was no longer safe. And yet, I didn't want safety. I wanted him. The black rose sat in a crystal vase on the edge of my windowsill, blooming like a bruise against the pale light. I couldn't sleep that night. Not after what he said. Not after what I felt when he said it. Julian Blackthorn was not a man who made promises. Not in business, not in love. But what he gave me on that rooftop wasn't a promise. It was a confession. One carved out of restraint, wrapped in warning, and soaked in the danger of us both losing control. I should have been terrified. But all I could think about was how close his mouth had been to mine when he whispered it. That morning, I barely made it out the door before my phone rang. "Pack a bag," Julian's voice came through the line, deep and unapologetic. I blanked. "Away? Where?" "Somewhere the world can't see us." I didn't ask again. The Blackthorn's private jet was too elegant to feel real. Leather seats, champagne, silence. Just him and me, and a sky full of clouds between us and the noise we left behind. He didn't touch me on the flight. Didn't need to. The tension hummed between us like static on glass. I could feel his gaze tracing every curve of my body when I wasn't looking. I pretended not to notice, but my skin heated wherever his eyes lingered. We landed in a snow-covered forest. A hidden chalet wrapped in glass and pine waited for us at the end of a private drive. The air smelled like wood smoke and winter. Inside, everything was warm, except him. He poured a drink and stood by the fire, one hand in his pocket, the other gripping a tumbler of whiskey. "Why here?" I asked, shrugging off my coat. I wore nothing but a silk camisole underneath, and I knew he noticed. His jaw flexed before he spoke. "Because if I touch you in the city, I won't stop." The words hit me like a velvet bullet. He moved to me slowly, like a predator who knew he didn't have to chase. "I want to paint you again," he said, voice low. but not in the studio, not under glass. I want to paint you here, when you're unguarded, when you're mine." His hand reached out, brushing the edge of my shoulder. "You already have every part of me," I whispered. "No," he said, "not yet." The next hours blurred. He painted me by the fireplace, the room flickering gold. I wore nothing but a deep red satin robe, loosely tied. My hair fell in waves, damp from snow. I sat on a velvet chaise, one leg curled beneath me, one shoulder bare. Julian didn't say much as he worked, but he looked at me like he was memorizing every inch, not just my skin, but the soul beneath it. When he finally stepped back, the portrait was unfinished, and he was undone. "I can't look at you like this," he murmured, putting the brush down. "Why not?" "Because it hurts." I swallowed. "What does? Wanting you this much." I stood, walked toward him slowly, until I was close enough to see the strain in his eyes. Then I said the one thing that finally shattered his restraint. "Then stop wanting me, Julian. Take me." And he did. He kissed me like it was a mistake he'd waited his whole life to make. His hands were everywhere, rough, reverent, desperate. He lifted me into his arms and carried me to the couch, the robe slipping open like an invitation. What happened next didn't feel like a painting. It felt like fire, like falling into something irreversible. We didn't speak afterward. We didn't need to. He held me as the fire crackled, our bodies tangled in silence, skin against skin. It was the first time Julian Blackthorne let go, and I knew something had changed, not just in him, but in me. I wasn't just his muse anymore. I was his weakness. And in the morning, the world would come knocking. Morning came with cruel clarity. The fire had died, but Julian's arms around me hadn't. He lay behind me, one hand resting at the curve of my waist, his breath warm against the back of my neck. For a moment, it felt like the world had melted away. Just me, him, and the soft hush of falling snow outside the glass walls of the chalet. But heaven never lasts long for sinners like us. His phone buzzed. Once, twice, then again. He didn't move, but I could feel the shift, the tension that crawled up his spine like a warning. 1,000 thoughts passed between us in silence. He reached for the phone. I turned my face into the pillow, pretending I wasn't listening. Tell them I'll be back by noon," he said, voice clipped, already colder. "No statements, not yet." He hung up. I stayed still. Then his hand trailed down my spine. "You're quiet." "I'm listening." "To what?" "To the moment before everything changes." He let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. "You think this changes?" I turned over, facing him. "Doesn't it?" His gaze swept across my face, slow and unreadable. He reached out, brushed a strand of hair from my cheek. His touch was gentle, too gentle for a man who had once only known how to control. "Yes," he said softly, "it does." And just like that, I felt my heart crack open. We returned to the city that afternoon. By the time we reached the Blackthorne penthouse, the illusion was over. A team of assistants waited in the foyer. His phone didn't stop ringing. And by the time Julian slipped on his tailored black suit, he looked like a stranger again. But I was different now, and they all knew it. The staff stared longer. His assistant avoided my eyes. Even the driver opened the car door for me like I had suddenly become someone. Because I had. The woman who had once been a hired sketch model now sat beside a man whose name made people move. We pulled up to the Blackthorne Gallery at dusk. A press van was parked out front. So were cameras. "Julian," I began. He turned to me. "It's your choice." "To do what? Walk in as a nobody? Or as mine?"
It wasn't romantic, it wasn't tender, but it was the most honest offer he'd ever made. So I nodded and took his hand. The crowd parted like a sea. Every wall in the gallery was bathed in soft light, but only one painting stole the room. Me. Nude, vulnerable, strong, captured in a moment only he had seen. And the name on the canvas said it all. Clara, study in fire. I turned to him. You never signed your name. I didn't need to, Julian said. It's written all over you. A flashbulb popped behind us. Dozens of voices called his name, then mine. Clara, Julian, Clara, Julian. And I realized this was no longer pretend. We were no longer hiding. He pulled me close in front of the cameras. His lips brushed my ear. They're going to talk. Let them. You're not afraid? I looked at him, feeling the quiet truth settle in my chest like a vow. I was never afraid of them. Then I paused. I was only afraid of falling in love with you. His lips touched mine, and the world, noisy, watching, ruthless, fell away. In the arms of a man who once painted pain, I had become something more than Muse. I had become his, and he had become mine.